You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to talk about a new report from our friends over at secondstreet.org. COVID has led to pay cuts in business, but no government has cut pay. Colin Craig is the president and joins me now. Colin, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on as always.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew.
So explain this. We've seen for the last year and a half businesses that have been forced by government fiat to shut down. We've had a lot of insecurity in the private sector on jobs, yet none of that insecurity and uncertainty has made its way to the public sector.
Yeah, that's basically it. As the pandemic emerged, we saw all these news stories about various businesses in many industries struggling and having no choice but to cut back on compensation. Everything from Chrysler in the automotive sector to oil and gas companies to entertainment companies like Cineplex, CFL teams. There were so many different stories. We thought, well, wait a second, there's one sector here that's missing, and that's the government. And so it got us thinking, when was the last time that governments actually cut employee pay? And so we filed these requests right across the country to ask that question.
I know that we haven't yet seen the totality of the financial toll that COVID has taken, and I include in that not just the pandemic itself, but also the lockdowns and restrictions and whatnot. But one thing that we know is that the private sector has to be responsive to the market. If your business goes down, you don't have enough money to keep your staff, and you don't need as many staff. In the case of government, we know from all of these business losses that the tax base had to shrink at least in some way, but that same responsiveness to revenue, to inflow, isn't there with government.
No, it's not, because governments just look at your kids and mine. They just rack up tons and tons of debt rather than saying, hey, wait a second, we got to curtail spending a bit. I don't think too many Canadians would say the government shouldn't have done anything in terms of relief in that. I think most people would agree that that was necessary. But just the overall largesse, there was no restraint on the government's part. So you had lots of people in the private sector taking pay reductions. And as our research found, really nothing in government. The federal government told us that they don't have any records of ever cutting employee pay. Never mind during the pandemic. Never at all. That's what they told us. Or if it did happen, it went so far back that everyone's forgotten and no one has any record of it. Provincially, pretty much across the country, provinces had no records on any kind of pay reductions. The last pay reductions seemed to have happened in the 1990s. Which, if you think about that, that's over 20 years ago now since there's been any real wage restraint in government at the provincial level. The one example that we did find was Manitoba, where employees were required to take 5 unpaid days off, which isn't the same as a pay cut, because with a pay cut, you still do the same amount of work. You just make less doing it. So that was one example provincially. And then at the city level, we saw that in Mississauga, they had 4 positions that will receive a pay reduction, but it's not for current employees, it's for future employees. So the bottom line is, out of millions and millions of government employees covered by our information requests, there were no pay cuts.
And when you talk about how far back this goes, yeah, it's possible that, in 1927, the fisheries department took a pay cut in some way. But we're talking about overwhelmingly compensation that's only ever rising and never going back, even when the economy itself retreats, it sounds like.
Yeah, basically. I mean, we fundamentally have 2 different societies when it comes to working in this country. You have those outside of government who, as you alluded to, have to face the ups and downs of the market. Companies have to respond. They have to compete. They have to be responsible. They can't just rack up enormous amounts of debt and not worry about how they're going to pay for it. And then on the other side of the equation is government. And government, and there's been hundreds of thousands of employees in government who actually received pay increases during the pandemic. In some cases, those were contracts that had been signed before the pandemic hit. But in other cases, you had the government out signing new contracts with pay increases during the pandemic. And the CTF, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, found that over 300,000 federal employees alone received a pay increase during the pandemic. So it's really 2 different worlds. And I think it's fair when people ask that question, how is this fair for everyday working people? Who are having to face these tough economic times, and yet they're paying for people in government who don't really have to face it.
I do get the question of fairness, but if you're a public sector worker who signed up to work for whatever department or whatever municipality under a certain set of circumstances, I can understand you listening to this interview right now and saying, well, hang on, why does other people's suffering have to become my suffering? I mean, isn't there an argument that instead of trying to be doing this race to the bottom, we could try to remove some of these barriers that were preventing the public sector from having prosperity, or the private sector rather?
Yeah, and I think we have to ask the question, well, when would the public sector ever have to feel the pinch? If not now, during a downturn when everyone else is, and they're the ones who are struggling to put food on their tables, and they're also having to pay for pay increases, and those in government to not ever be affected. It doesn't seem like a fair argument to say that those in government should never have their belts tightened. And to be fair, it's not the case that there's never any restraint. You will see pay freezes in government. That is not, you will see that from time to time, but it's the actual pay cut, a 5% cut, a 10% pay cut, whatever it is. It's really become unheard of in government. Like I say, the last examples that we identified went back to the 1990s in Ontario. They had Ray Days, which is similar to what I talked about with what Manitoba did, where they had unpaid days. They did do that up to 12 unpaid days. Manitoba did something similar. In Alberta, they did a 5% pay reduction. PEI did something, I believe it was in the late 90s too. So you did see those examples in the 90s and at the provincial level, but really it's been a totally different world since the 90s. And you have this sort of two society state where you have those in government who really are not affected by what's happening in the outside world, and then those in the outside world, people in private sector, nonprofits, and that quite often do have to feel the pinch.
And how do the underlying circumstances that led to that austerity in the 90s compare to the challenges in the last year and a half?
That's a very good question. My guess would be that it would pale in comparison to what we're facing today. I mean, you look at the federal government alone, they racked up hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in debt in 1 year alone. Simply to pay for the pandemic. A lot of provinces are back swimming in debt again. So there's a lot of very tough financial situations out there. And I think really what people might want to reflect on is this. How do we address this situation we're in? We've got government spending way more than what they're bringing in revenues, and that is not sustainable. So how do you deal with it? And often governments present two scenarios. They say we either cut services or we raise taxes. Now, I think a lot of the services that Canadians receive from governments, they probably wouldn't want those cut. Policing, healthcare, people fixing roads and bridges. And then on the other end of the equation, you've got raising taxes. No one wants to see taxes go up right now because that would hurt a lot of families that are struggling and a lot of businesses that are struggling. So you often hear these two scenarios. There is a third, and that is to do a better job with the revenues that governments have right now. And one thing they can do is cut salaries back a little bit, cut pensions back a little bit, bring the compensation packages back down to size so that they're more fair with what people in outside government are receiving for the same type of work. And that's one way you can ensure the services continue. It's just done a little bit more cost effectively.
I know this was a multi-government level project on your part. You went across the country, federal, provincial, municipal. What were the standout examples, really the worst examples, either for lack of transparency or just for how little in the way of restraint they were exhibiting?
That's a very good question. A lot of governments didn't even know when the last time was that they reduced pay. Like I said, Ottawa told us they don't have any records of ever doing that. I believe it was New Brunswick as well that did that. In Calgary is a city that has been struggling for a good 5 or 6 years now because of the oil and gas downturn especially. And they gave us data going back to the 1970s showing that there has been no pay cuts at all, zero. And so there's a lot of examples like that where we know that different parts of the country have struggled economically. And you can see that governments just kind of sailed right through, that there was no wage restraint whatsoever. And I think ultimately the big picture is that we see these studies from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, from the Fraser Institute and others that show this compensation gap. Government employees making more in terms of their total compensation than people outside of government doing similar work. And so the end result is this: you have everyday taxpayers that have to pay more for those in government to make this higher compensation level. So, the end result is it costs everyday people more in taxes. And to be clear, I wouldn't look at the everyday worker in government and say, well, this is their fault. I mean, most people just go to work and they want to put in an honest day's work and get a good paycheck for it. But it's ultimately elected officials and governments that agree to these contracts, and they've let these compensation levels run away from what would be competitive.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, and I know it's outside the scope of this report, but to look at the general imbalance between public and private sector pay for the same jobs in general, because this is something I know other research has shown is already an area where there's a significant gap. So the public sector employees for the same job in the private sector are making more, and pensions, I mean, we could go on all day with this, but I'm glad you've done the work on this. Secondstreet.org has the new report finding no evidence of any major governments dropping pay despite private sector businesses having to do that or just shut down altogether. Colin Craig, Second Street's president, joins us now. Thanks so much for coming on, Colin.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. And if any of your viewers or listeners would like to actually see the government responses, they're all on our website. They can see them for themselves.
Perfect. And we'll put it up on the screen there right now. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon, Colin.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.